I'm Daniel Parson. My new venture is Parson Produce. Scott talked a little bit about the garden called Gaia Gardens in Atlanta. That's where I've been for the last 5 years. And my wife got a job teaching college in Clinton, South Carolina, so that's where we are now. And Parson Produce is my new venture. You can find me on the web at www.parsonorganics.com. And feel free to email me or call me if you have other questions after today. I will try to answer them. This is the big picture. Scott already showed this picture once, but this is Gaia Gardens from space. And what I'd like to point out, Scott pointed out the pond and the housing community. The housing community owned the land. I managed it as a farm and sold my produce through the community-supported agriculture program. I had 64 members who mostly paid in advance, but all signed up in advance for the whole season of 30 weeks. So from mid-April to mid-November, 64 people would show up at my place, and I'd have to have enough food to give out a nice variety to each of them. So that was my challenge. They made the commitment to me financially that they would support me, and I made the commitment to them that I would support them with vegetables. I was also able to go to farmers market to help with the costs of inputs and labor and all that. And I took about a third of my produce there to the farmers market. And it's nice to have two different markets so that the CSA members don't get too many of one thing, and that I can plant enough of everything to know that I will have enough. And it was certified organic. I'm not certified organic at my new place yet. It takes a couple of years from the last application of a prohibited substance, a no-no chemical, to be certified, and it's been about 2 years on the new place since they applied a nitrogen for their pasture. These are, Jim Riddle is somebody who's been instrumental in the national organic movement and the national organic program. The USDA now regulates what is referred to as organic. And these are some of the values that he points out are important to organic growers. And I think they're all equally important and not included in all the values of conventional agriculture. You see some things like consumer safety, food security, health. All these are important aspects of organic agriculture and reasons that we do it. It includes things like fun. There's integrity included in the values of organic, and the fulfillment of spiritual needs through this type of agriculture and gardening. So things like flavor, food quality, these are all very important. Humane livestock treatment. I know vegetarian is better, but humane treatment is also important if you're raising livestock. Genetic diversity and biodiversity. So these are some of the things to think about when you're thinking about organic farming. It's not just about whether we use chemicals or not, or whether we're eating the chemicals or not. It also includes these other values. And this is from organiccenter.org on the web. You can go there and get a lot of information about organic farming, and particularly about studies that have been done, scientific studies that have been done concerning organic farming. So this is just one that I looked at from environmental health perspectives about organic eating in children. They did an experiment where they fed children a conventional diet that's just whatever you get from the grocery store versus children who were eating specifically organic food. Now that came from the grocery store as well probably, but it was organic. What they found was that the kids were passing chemicals through their bodies when they were eating conventional produce, but after a couple of days on an organic diet, they were no longer being exposed to those chemicals. And organophosphate is an insecticide used in conventional agriculture that can be on some of the foods that you find at the grocery store, and it's specifically a neurological development inhibitor. So you can see how important it is to eat organic food that doesn't contain these chemicals. Now, not all conventional food will have this chemical on it, but organic certainly won't have it. So That's one of the reasons that we go organic, but the values that I just showed are a range of reasons to do organic gardening. I think especially if you're doing it yourself, it's important to do organic, because there are a lot of choices in this world and a lot of choices just in the grocery store, and you don't always know whether the organic food is safer for you as a consumer. But what I can tell you is that organic food is safer for the people who grow it, because they are not exposed to the pesticides. And if we're growing the food ourselves, I think it's the way to go. So we'll go to the next slide, and this is the National Organic Standards Board. They are governing the USDA national program. So if you see certified organic on vegetables, this is the program that allows a grower to use that label and call their food organic. I think it's a really good definition. It really tells you everything you need to know about organic gardening. It's a production system that's managed to respond to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. So right here we see that it's a managed system. So we're actually doing something to help grow the food. If you have a pecan tree in your backyard and you've never done anything to it, it's not an organic pecan because you're not managing it. So that's part of the definition, is the management. And it's site specific. So what works for you might not work for the person down the road, because you're going to have different site with different conditions. And the way of growing has to address that. It can't be the same everywhere. And then a lot of people focus on organics. Well, you can't use this, you can't use that, you can't use synthetic chemicals. But actually, it's more about what you can do. And the next line tells you about that. You can use cultural, biological, and mechanical practices. Those are the things that are allowed in organic farming, or that are part of organic farming. And what you're trying to do along with that is cycle resources, like Scott was talking about, using on-farm or on your property resources. Don't put your leaves out on the side of the road to get picked up. Now, if you live in the country, they don't do that for you, but in town they do. And that's a great gold mine of resources for you to use. And that's just one example. Promoting ecological balance and conserving biodiversity. And I'll go into all these in detail on the next few slides. Cultural practices. Now, I have students come visit the farm, sometimes student groups, and I'll ask them, what do you think a cultural practice is? And sometimes one group said, well, it's, when we come out here, that's a cultural thing. Maybe if you host a play or something, that would be cultural. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about culture in the growing of the food. So it's things that are done just in your methods of growing, really. Crop rotation is one of the most important things that I do, that in your own garden you may or may not be able to rotate the crops, but I think it's really important to understand the ideas behind crop rotation. And there are certain things that you can rotate your garden for. Even if you have a small plot, you can grow something here one year and in a different place the next. Variety selection for resistance is really important for organic farmers. Now, we don't want to plant any of the GMO crops. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about varieties that are selected for resistance to diseases, especially tomatoes. You'll see in the seed catalogs initials by the variety sometime, and that is telling you what it is resistant to, like fusarium wilt or nematodes or other things. So if you have a specific problem with your tomatoes or whatever crop, you might find that there's a variety that is not as susceptible to that problem as other varieties are. So that's an important thing to use, because then you don't even have to think about, well, what am I going to do about this? You can plant a different variety, and that may take care of the problem. Water management, fertility management are both cultural practices. By water management, I'm thinking of reducing runoff, for one thing. Keeping the water on your plants where it needs to be by using mulch, something like that, or how you water your plants, whether it's overhead irrigation or by hand or using drip irrigation. I've found drip irrigation to be the best way, the most efficient way to water my plants. And There's a place called DripWorks out in California. You can get their catalog online, and they're a real good source for home gardeners or farmers alike. Farmscaping or landscaping for beneficial insects is an important cultural practice. I'll talk a little bit more about beneficials in the biological part, but farmscaping is a cultural practice that can increase the number of beneficial insects. Scott showed some pictures of those beneficials eating other bugs, and I'll tell you a little bit about how to increase them in the biological part of my talk. Mulching and organic matter. Organic matter is the one thing you can do for your soil that will do so many different things. Any organic matter you can add to your soil will increase the nutrients in your soil. It will increase the capacity of your soil to hold nutrients, and it will increase the capacity of your soil to hold water. But it will also increase the capacity of your soil to allow good, proper drainage of water. So it's like a magical thing to have organic matter added to your soil. And mulching is one way to do that. This is a picture that illustrates some of these concepts. Now on the back you may not be able to see that very well, but there are several practices in the picture. One of them is reduced tillage. On the left I have crops growing. That's actually a squash crop, and there's grass in between. So I'm just tilling the middle of the bed where I can plant my squash, and as it grows to the edge, to the grass, I can actually till the grass in then, and that helps hold the soil longer rather than having the whole field tilled at one time. And you can do this in your home garden as well, whether you grow grass in between the aisles or put down mulch in between the aisles. It's a good thing to leave a portion of it undisturbed, because a lot of the beneficial soil organisms that Scott was talking about, things you can't see, they like undisturbed soil. And if you have some of that in your garden, they'll more readily colonize what you're tilling or disturbing in order to plant your crop. Another thing there is drip irrigation. You can see the black lines through the field. Those are drip lines. They're going to feed the tomatoes with water. And the straw there is a mulch. Now straw or hay mulch is kind of tricky because there will be some seeds in there that might come up and become weeds in your garden. So I use straw in the summertime because it's wheat or rye or oats, and they don't like to come up, they don't like to grow very well in the summer when my tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants are there. So I use that as a mulch in the summer. I would not mulch my cabbage with straw if you paid me, because it would come up and overshadow the cabbage in no time. But on tomatoes it'll work because it's the wrong season for the grass. Then the little black piles there, that's compost. That's a biological method, but also a cultural method. It's a way of growing. And the tomatoes are on raised beds. The raised beds allows water to drain properly away from the plants. You want to have adequate water, but you don't want them to sit in water. So the raised beds allows that, and I do mechanical cultivation, I hoe my crops, and you have to do that when it's dry. So the raised beds will dry out much more quickly, the surface of them will, so I can get in there and do what I need to do for weed control. One thing about organic gardening is that everything is linked. It's all integrated, and that's part of that definition I showed earlier, the integration of these parts. So when you're planting, you need to be thinking about weeding, thinking about harvesting, thinking about pest control. And in every step, you're thinking about all those challenges that relate to gardening. These are ways that you can encourage the natural biology that exists in your garden in order to grow better food. The number one I've got there is encouraging natural enemies. So whatever you can do to encourage those predators, those carnivores, to come to your garden and eat the vegetarian insects, that is. So releasing beneficial insects is another thing that a lot of people have heard of, is you buy ladybugs or whatever and you release them in your garden. For certain things this works. For insects that don't survive our winters, it works. The Pediobius wasp will attack Mexican bean beetles. You have to introduce it if you're going to have it, but you got to have the pest there for it to live, or it's going to go somewhere else, or it's going to starve and die. And that is the main way you encourage natural enemies, is by providing the habitat that they need in order to live. If you buy a bunch of ladybugs and release them in your garden and you don't have the habitat, they're going to go away. And you've spent money on them. So I think the best way is to encourage them, bring them in, get them to live and flourish in your garden. What they need is water. They need things to eat. So they do have to have the pests. And that's where the concept of ecological balance comes in, because they need to have something to eat. So you don't want to eradicate your pests. You just want the balance to be tipped in your favor, so that you can grow a crop while some of the pests exist. Using compost is a biological practice because compost has great nutrients, organic matter in it, but it's also full of good soil life. So you want to have a high quality compost. Whether you're making it yourself or buying it, it's got to be something of good quality. I'll talk a little bit more about compost making in a bit. Cover crops and farmscaping. You can do this in your garden. You can actually grow cover crops. These are crops grown to enrich the soil, especially during the winter time. You know, if you don't like to grow winter crops, which is a great thing to do, is to grow things during the winter, but if you don't like to do that, instead of just tilling your garden in the fall and leaving it to weeds, plant some rye. That's a cereal or grain rye, or oats or wheat, and a legume like clover, Austrian winter peas. One thing you can find everywhere these days is a bag of wildlife mix for deer plots at any feed and seed. This is, if you get a good mix, it's probably the perfect mix to put out on your garden. You don't have to think about, well, how much of this do I buy or that? Buy the mix and put it out there. Biopesticides are something you can use in organic farming. I choose to spray as little as possible, even though I'm spraying with natural things that have come from nature. But those are some things that you can do. I use BT. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And field sanitation, just keeping, if you have diseased plants, getting them out of the garden. That's the one time I'd recommend throwing things away, is if they have a terrible disease, you can actually put them in the trash, not in your compost. But things that are, plants that are otherwise healthy, even if they're infested by insects or something, should go back into the soil, either right there in the garden or get composted and eventually go back in. So the next slide is a picture that illustrates the concept of attracting beneficial insects. This is a crop of kale and broccoli with buckwheat growing in between. Now this picture was taken moments before the buckwheat was plowed in, because the crop is getting just big enough and the buckwheat just big enough so that they start competing. So I take down the buckwheat. But buckwheat has got nectaries, so insects can come in and get nectar and pollen that they need to reproduce. The beneficial insects often are predators, but they also eat nectar and pollen. So that's part of creating that habitat for them. So that's something that you could do in your garden as well, is once you get your plants established, throw out some buckwheat if it's the right season, a warm season, and it'll grow and flower and attract beneficials. So we'll go to the next slide. It is a list of some of the mechanical practices that we use. Sometimes people will come for a farm tour and they'll say, can you use tractors in organic farming? But they burn oil. I don't understand. They burn gas. Well, we can use tractors in organic farming. Otherwise, I don't think there'd be much organic food on the shelves. But we need it for tillage. Tillage is mainly for ease of planting, ease of cultivating. It's got short-term benefits to the soil, like making it fluffy, aerated, mixing in compost or amendments. But it's a long-term detriment. If you till too much, you'll actually destroy the soil structure. So really, the less you can till, the better. That's one kind of rule of thumb. If you can avoid tilling your soil, that's a good thing. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but the less you do it, the better. Cultivation for weed control using a hoe is a mechanical practice. You can use row covers to keep pests out of your crops. If you have trouble with, for example, on squash, the vine borer is a terrible pest. If you've ever grown squash, it'll start producing maybe, and then it'll just wilt down, and you see the frass or caterpillar poo outside of the vine. That's a vine borer, and before the squash blooms, you can actually cover this with a light sheet. I use an agricultural row cover fabric, but you could just use a sheet. Now once it blooms, the bees have to get in there and pollinate it, or else the squash or cucumbers won't develop properly. But that's an example of a mechanical practice. Trellising is another practice that keeps down disease and makes it easier to pick. Things like sugar snap peas or tomatoes need to be trellised. That keeps the airflow going through, and that really helps with disease. Plastic mulch is also a mechanical practice. It's a petroleum product, but it's a physical barrier. It's a mechanical barrier to weeds coming through. So the next slide shows tillage. This is actually in a farm up in Massachusetts called Food Bank Farm, where they have a CSA, but they also take half of their food to the CSA, the other half goes to a food bank. And they're able to feed people who have great needs food while also making a living. It's a beautiful place. They have 55 acres. Now, my place is 1.5 acres. I can't imagine doing it on 55. But this is one way they do it. They have machines that go in and weed the crops. The one on the left is doing a stale bedding. He's shallow cultivating the aisle in between to keep the weeds from taking hold. And she is checking on plants because she's got a tool that vibrates in and out of the row and actually weeds right up to the plant. But you can do all this with a hoe, with a hand hoe or hand pulling. But this is just an example of mechanical practice on an organic farm. Next, I'm going to give a few words on weeds. If you could go to the next slide. Cultivating with the hoe. Weed early and often, just like you vote. Okay? Before you see the weeds, practically, you want to weed. I'll take new people to the farm, interns coming in, and we'll look at a bed and I'll say, where are the weeds? And they'll say, I don't know, I don't see them. And we'll get down on the ground and we'll see the weeds just emerging, just the tiniest thing. That's exactly when you want to use your hoe and weed those things out, because after that it's too late. You can just cultivate, scratch up the soil, dry out those tiny little thread stage weeds, and you don't have to pull big guys or cut them down. You're just cultivating. Shallow weeding is the best because it's going to prevent future weed germination. When you plow or uncover the soil, weeds will germinate. If you cultivate shallowly, you're not uncovering new soil again. So new weeds are less likely to germinate. So shallow, early, and often. Mulching is a great way to garden. You just kind of fix it and forget it. You can put the mulch down at the beginning of the season, and when I talk about mulch, I'm talking about a thick layer of mulch, 2 to 4 inches. You don't want to see any ground. Any ground you see means that a weed can see the sunlight looking up. So you want to mulch thickly with something that's good organic matter that's going to break down again in your soil and actually feed your plants. So it's a wonderful way to do it. Hand pulling for me is the last resort. If a weed is big enough where I can grab it and pull it out, I haven't done my job properly. So, but I do have to do it sometimes, and especially in the mulch, things will come up, and of course you can't cultivate with a hoe once you've got the mulch down. I don't know if Scott was going to point out the tools later, but I'll just show off one hoe. This is called a half moon hoe. You can see it's half moon, and the special thing about it is it's got a narrower blade than maybe what you're used to seeing. It's kept very sharp for that shallow cultivation, and it's also got a long handle. I use it with my thumbs up, and that way I can stand up straight. If I'm standing up straight, I can do this all day. If I've got my thumbs down, I'm bent over and I can't do it an hour or two and my back starts hurting. So, I'm a young guy, but I got to do it all day. So I got to pay attention to my body and how I'm using it, how I'm using my tools. There are 2 schools of thought in growing plants, in fertilizing. One is, do you feed the plant? And the other is feeding the soil. Now, it's long been thought that organic farmers feed the soil and conventional farmers feed the plant. And this is true to an extent. The soluble fertilizers, Miracle Grow, All that stuff is feeding the plant. It's not feeding the life in the soil. And a lot of the organic stuff that we do is feeding the soil, and that breaks down and feeds the plant. But really, you want to do both. You want to make sure you're feeding your soil for long-term fertility throughout the season and into the next season and the next. And you also want to make sure that plant has what it needs in order to complete its life cycle when you're in the garden. So there are some things that are less soluble. You can use finely ground rock, the mulch, compost, and cover crops. And you can feed the plant with bagged organic fertilizer and things like fish emulsion or kelp extract, which are liquids. So they work a little bit like the Miracle Grow. You can, if you have a deficiency in a plant that's already growing, you've already prepared and planted the garden, you can add this liquid fertilizer. Fish emulsion is an example. Now, one thing to note, if you actually go to the store and look for organic fertilizers, the word organic on a fertilizer bag or a bottle of fish emulsion does not mean what it means on a vegetable in the grocery store. The vegetables in the grocery store are part of this National Organic Program, and they can be certified organic and have to be labeled so in the grocery store. The fertilizer bag, not so much. When it says 10-10-10, now that part is regulated on the label of a fertilizer bag, but when it says organic on the fertilizer, that is not regulated. It doesn't mean what you think it means, which is that it could be used on an organic farm. There is an institute called the Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI. OMRI. That's what you want to look for on a fertilizer bag. That's going to tell you this is okay for use in your organic garden. So if you do go to the store and have to buy some fertility, we like on-farm or in the garden sources, but if you have to go and buy it, that's what you're looking for, OMRI. So those are the things that you can use to build the soil. Now the next slide is showing off my cover crops. This is a beautiful field of Sudan grass, soybeans, and buckwheat growing in the summertime. Now I can, at this stage, I'll actually mow it down, and the sorghum Sudan grass will grow up again. Everything else will kind of die out. And I can keep mowing it every few weeks during the summer and keep that cover crop going as long as I want. Or I could plow it into the soil to feed the soil. The legumes add nitrogen. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen, and it is broken down by bacteria that live in the roots of legume plants. And that's why beans are so high in protein. Protein is full of nitrogen amino acids. And so when you make that link, you realize that you can actually bring nitrogen into your system by growing soybeans. Now, who wants to support a chemical plant to feed your plant when you can actually grow a bean in your garden and feed the soil with nitrogen? So I like that better because I get organic matter. It's part of my living system. If I save seeds, I can actually plant it again next year. In fact, buckwheat, I allow it to reseed, and if I plow, buckwheat comes up. It's a really easy weed to weed out. And if I want the soil covered, it'll come back up within a week or two of plowing. So this tells you a little bit more. These are some examples of legumes and grasses that I use. I grow in time off, and I do rotations, so I have specific times off in each field. A lot of people would just have time off in the winter time, and that's fine. But you'll grow it in the proper season, and when it gets to early bloom stage, it's time to cut it and turn it under or leave it on the surface as mulch. But that's the time you want to get it. For the most part, you don't want the cover crops to go to seed. They can become invasive weeds that you don't want in your garden. But if you get them when you see the first blooms, or on the grasses when they just start to form little heads, and you cut them, they will die out because they think they've pretty much completed their life cycle. They've already gotten to that bloom stage, and they're not going to come back up for the most part. So, like I mentioned before, you want the cereal crops to plant, and the wildlife mixes are a great way to just get a mix for the wintertime or whenever, readily available. All right, the next slide talks about feeding the soil with mulch. The reason to mulch is weeds, moisture, and soil food, all three. If you use a high carbon mulch, like straw or wood chips, it will actually starve nitrogen from your soil. So I try to avoid wood chips, especially if they haven't been decomposed. They are very high in carbon, and the soil microbes will grab that carbon and they hold tightly to nitrogen. So they're going to grab that carbon and grab some nitrogen, and they're better at getting the nitrogen than your plants are. So it may set your garden back if you use too much of the wood chips, or you don't want to till wood chips into your soil. You can apply something like compost layer and then the wood chips, and you won't have that problem because the compost will be between the wood chips and the soil. But that high nitrogen content is also what makes it a good mulch, because it will stay on the surface of the soil for the season. If you use your grass clippings for mulch, that's a great feeder of the soil. But they're probably going to decompose before your tomatoes are done. So they're a good mulch, but they have that aspect. And I already talked about the beauty of organic matter. It is the one thing you can increase in your soil that will do a lot of things good for it. Okay, the next slide is about compost. And this is about what you get from compost. You get the best kind of organic matter. There's active organic matter. If you cut a living plant down and put it on the soil, that's active. It's going to actively decompose. And then there's less active organic matter. And this organic matter does great things for the characteristics of your soil, the more decomposed it is. And that's what compost is. Compost is actually the decomposition and recomposition of organic matter. It does not just break down into its component parts. It's actually built back up by the microbes into more complex molecules that will stay in your soil a long period of time and do a lot of good for your garden. So it's a great thing to use and to make. You want to balance carbon and nitrogen in your compost. Who here has made compost before? All right, good. So we have some experience in the room. It's commonly called green and brown. The green stuff is high in nitrogen, and the brown stuff is high in carbon. And you want to mix those two together to make a good compost. Now, grass clippings are green, and they're high in nitrogen. Vegetables, uncooked vegetables from your kitchen, scraps and whatnot, are green. They're high in nitrogen. Even if they are brown in color, they're going to be high in nitrogen. You can mix that with things that are high in carbon. The best thing to make as a carbon source is leaves. Leaves piled up or shredded on their own will decompose. So you don't even have to think about it. You just add your green stuff and your leaves, and it will rot. If you use wood chips, you have to be more careful, because on their own, they will take a long time to break down. Eventually they will, but they'll take a long, long time. So leaves are a great thing to add. If you actually rake your yard, collect all those. If you, to mow your lawn, it's best to mulch it right there and put it right back into the grass. But if you pick that up, save that for your compost and use it in your garden. Compost does so much for the soil structure and nutrients and microbes. Quality counts in compost. You want air and water to be in your compost. When you grab a handful of compost, it should be damp like a wrung out sponge. And that's the kind of water that you want in it. If you have too much water, you're not going to have enough air. So you don't want too much. You don't want to squeeze it and have water squirting out. Then you have too much water, not enough air. But if you have enough air, you're going to have a good, safe compost. You can make killer compost that'll kill your plants if you let it go anaerobic. And you can make good compost that is aerobic and will benefit your plants and your soil. Sorry, the ratio green to brown. I hesitate to give you a hard and fast ratio of green to brown, but usually 4:1 is considered to be proper. 4 brown to 1 green. But it's going to depend a lot on what you're using. If it's higher in nitrogen greens, then you may need more browns and vice versa. So if you're using wood chips, use a lot less than 4:1. It's actually a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 30:1, but that's a little more complicated. 4:1 brown to green. Feeding the soil with finely ground rock. Now these rock products, phosphate rock, green sand, which has potassium and is good for soil building, Those are long-term nutrients. If you have a phosphorus or potassium deficiency and you apply these finely ground rocks, you may not see the difference that year, but you should start to see it in the second year. And the advantage of that long-term thing is that you'll still see it in the third year and the fourth year. Lime is one that people use a whole lot. Now, conventional fertilizers are acidic, and that's why people commonly will lime every single year if they're using conventional fertilizers. Organic fertilizers can be basic or non-acidic, or they're neutral. So they're a lot easier on the soil, and you don't generally have to use as much lime if you're doing organic gardening. Gypsum is a source of calcium, and it has sulfur, but has no effect on pH. So if you're low on calcium, you can use gypsum. And on the lime, if you can find it, look for high calcium lime. There are two types of lime. One has a lot of magnesium in it. That's dolomitic. It's the most common form of lime. But if you have a good supplier, they'll have high calcium lime, which is going to be better for your soil to bring in more of the calcium. Take soil tests. Now, you might be surprised to see that I say take soil tests every 2 years. Because you might have thought, well, I'm going to take my soil test every year. I've got to find out what to put on it that year. But the truth is that your typical soil tests do not address the nitrogen content of your soil. And the reason is that nitrogen is in many different forms and is very changeable in the soil. It's hard to measure, and so they don't measure it. The UGA or state extension agent is going to have a nitrogen recommendation based on what they call zero-based budgeting, which means they figure you don't have any nitrogen in your soil, so you're going to apply it all. And with organic gardening, if you're doing things right, you're mulching, you're incorporating compost, you're going to have some nitrogen there. A rule of thumb, I tend to apply about half of what they recommend from those standard soil tests in terms of nitrogen. I have better results, fewer pests on my plants, and better results that way. So I usually cut those in half. Phosphorus and potassium are the next two most important elements, although all of them are important. You can convert these recommendations to organic. Now, if you have a supplier that you use, they may be able to convert it for you, but you have to, we didn't have time to go through all this, but you can convert it. What they tell you to put it in pounds of 10, 10, 10, you can convert it to organic recommendations. There's a website I want to tell you about called attra.org, attra.org. Has anybody been to the Attra website? No? You should all go home and go to this website because there's great information about organic growing. They have a ATTRA, Attra, attra.org, ATTRA. This is a service of our government, and it's a wonderful service because they give you great information about growing different things, different pests you might have, and they do have one on organic fertility and how to convert the recommendations. And this is some of the things that I've already talked about bagged amendments. You're looking for the OMRI seal. They're going to be a mixture of plant, animal, and mineral ingredients. So there again, biological and mechanical practices. I can dig rock out of the ground, grind it up, and put it on my garden. I can use plant and animal material because those are biological entities. There's usually a mix of soluble and insoluble ingredients in organic fertilizers, so some that are slow release and some that are faster, whereas conventional is very fast release. And I want to have some that will stay there for the whole season and be there for my next year's crop as well. So this is a way to feed your plants if your soil doesn't have enough nutrients for them. Next slide is the soluble fish in kelp. A couple ways that you can use this. It's the most plant available of any of the nutrients that you could apply organically. So if you're having a problem, you're seeing yellowing of leaves, for example, and you need to get nitrogen to that plant immediately, this is the way to go. A couple ways to do it. If they're in containers, you can drench the soil with the solution, and that's a great way to do your transplants. When you go to transplant out of flats, soak them in a fish emulsion or a kelp solution. That'll give them some nutrients and also make them really wet for going in. That way, if you don't have time to get back there and water the next couple of days, they'll have their water right there in the transplant. And foliar feeding is something you probably won't you probably won't use, but I'm starting to experiment with it. But you can apply these solutions to the underside of the leaves by spraying, and the plants will actually take up some of the nutrient. But you do it early in the morning when the dew is still on the plants. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll start to talk about pest control. This is the final frontier. If you've done everything else right, you may not have pest problems, and I hope that you don't. And this is where a lot of people may be able to do the organic fertility, but then when the pests start eating their plants, they go to grab the chemicals, and this is the last thing you want to do. The chemicals for pest control are going to kill your pests and your beneficial insects, so you're going to be behind again. And they'll also be bad for the soil structure, because anything you spray on the plant is eventually going to get washed off into the soil. So proper rotations in fertility are the first thing to do. The next thing is to identify the pest and its life cycle. So if you see a bug on your plant, you've got to know what that bug is before you think about killing it. Scott illustrated this point with the Mexican bean beetle, whose eggs look like the ladybug eggs. So you need to know what you're looking at. There are some less subtle differences between these, but if you don't know what you're looking at in the insect world, you may not pick up on those obvious differences if you don't look into it. So you need to know what you're dealing with and what its life cycle is, because you may not be able to kill or squish the adult, but if you know what the eggs look like or the larvae looks like, or maybe there's an organic material that's effective against the larvae or eggs, but not the adult. So you identify it, learn its life cycle, learn what it does. Sometimes you can use other practices, for example, Colorado potato beetle. If you have a problem with that on your potatoes, you can mulch those plants instead of filling them up with soil, and the potato beetles don't like that. So that's a practice you can use instead. So you want to try a cultural or physical control. Physical control can be picking the cabbage worms off of your cabbage or broccoli, and if you eat it, that's a biological control. Okay, so who here has eaten a cabbage worm off of a cabbage or broccoli? Anybody know what they taste like? You are what you eat, right? They taste like cabbage and broccoli. I've had whole classes of students eating cabbage worms and doing biological control. One spring I had several student groups come out over a couple weeks, and I controlled the cabbage worms in my field by carnivory of humans on. So if that doesn't work, you can seek a natural material that will help you control those insects. So again, you're looking for the OMRI seal if you go to the store and look for a material. One of the things that I use is, I'll talk about some of those later. So let's go ahead on to the next slide. This is a syrphid fly. It looks kind of like a bee, but it's actually a fly. And this is a story that I like to tell because it's an interesting one for the garden. Up top is a picture of the syrphid fly feeding on a buckwheat plant that I planted at my garden. And down below is a picture of one of his cousins in a book on plant protection, biological control. So I know he's there and I know what he's doing. He or she, actually. The female will lay eggs in a bed of aphids. Aphids tend to, they suck juices out of plants and they tend to clump up. And the female will lay eggs right there in the center of that aphid colony, and the larva, when it hatches, will eat aphids, okay? That larva will turn into an adult, just like a butterfly emerges from the cocoon. The flies do as well. And the adult, both male and female adults, will eat nectar. But the female won't be able to lay eggs unless she has the minerals from pollen. And that's what they can get, nectar and pollen from the buckwheat. So what happens is they'll eat the nectar, and then if they can't find the pollen, the female will go somewhere else and lay eggs. Over to you neighbors, over to my place. Okay, so you need to have some things for them to eat at your place because you want her to be able to feed and lay eggs and have her young there at your place. So I think it's a real important story to tell about completing the life cycle of these beneficials. And I really can't tell you about all of them. I don't have time to go through all of them, but this is something to explore on your own. Start identifying these pests and beneficials in your garden. Start learning how you can encourage them. These are ways you can find pests. You can find their damage. Sometimes they're droppings, or sometimes both. Sometimes you'll see the eggs, and sometimes you'll see the pest. Cutworms are one that you may never see. You plant a little broccoli in the fall, and you come out, and the thing is just snipped off at the base, like somebody came along with scissors and cut it off. And that's a cutworm, and you may not see the pest, but you see that, and you know it's a cutworm, and you dig around, and you can find it. Sometimes you can find it right there just below the soil surface. They come out at night. They curl around and cut off that plant. But during the day, they go under the soil, and sometimes you can find that, and that's how you can control it. Another way to address cutworms is by cutting a toilet paper roll in half and sticking that around your little plant, and the cutworms can't get around the plant then. Or some people use tinfoil that's embedded a little bit in the soil and wrapped around the stem of that plant so the cutworm can't get to it. Those are just some examples of understanding the pest life cycle and some of the signs that you're seeing of the pest. Like Scott was saying, the tomato hornworm, you come out and your tomatoes are defoliated. Hornworms are hard to see, but when you see that major damage, just get down and look. You'll find the hornworm on your tomatoes. So you're looking for these signs of them. And you can look it up for yourself on the internet, or if you have a book about it, or take it to your garden center or extension agent. They may know what it is. See where it lives all year. See if it has alternate hosts. You may not know that you're growing something that is harboring pests in another part of your yard. So that's something that you need to find out if you find these pests. So we'll go to the next slide. I've already talked about some of these. Crop timing is a way to do cultural pest control. The vine borer in squash. I plant my squash as early as I can, and I get about 7 weeks of good harvest, and then the vine borers or something else gets to it, and that's how I deal with that. I grow it about 7 weeks of the year. I can harvest squash, and that's fine with me. I just plant it real early. So timing is one way to do it. And like Scott was saying, you want to grow your crops in the best time for them to grow. So you want to plant your cool season vegetables in the early spring, start planting out in the garden in 1st of March, or maybe a little bit later up here, maybe the 15th. And then your warm season stuff, you don't want to plant it until the soil is warm and you're not going to have frost. Does anybody know what the last frost date for this area is? Middle of April? Sometime in April, April 15th or 18th?
Yeah, it's in the middle.
Okay. I think Atlanta is about the 15th. It may be earlier, so it may be a little bit later up here. Yeah.
A couple of years ago, we got a frost at the end of April.
Yeah.
End of April? Do you know what the date was?
It was pretty close to the end of April.
Okay.
My mother-in-law said she'd never planted before the end of April.
Okay. People have all different ways to do it, and she's probably right, because I like to plant my tomatoes May 1st. It's warm, they'll grow fast, and you get a crop almost the same time. But at that last frost date, if it's April 15th, that means there's a 10% chance that you could have frost after that date. Typically is what they call those final frost dates. So it's a pretty good bet that you won't have frost. Help out your neighbors with pests. If they have bad pests in their garden, they're not taking care of it, help them out, because that's one way that you can be colonized by pests. If you are spraying some of these organic pesticides, remember that they can be dangerous as well. They are dangerous as well. So you really don't want to use them, but if you do use the OMRI-listed organic pesticides, use them with care and caution, just like you would with anything that is dangerous. You have to wear long pants, long shirt, gloves, if you're spraying anything in the garden. That's a good rule of thumb. Now the fish in kelp solution, that's okay. You can do that barefoot with shorts on, but anything that is a pesticide, definitely you need protection, even if it's an organic one. And use common sense. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So these are a couple of things that I actually use. These are really the two that I use. BT is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacterium that was found in the soil naturally occurring, and they've grown it out, and you can buy it in a powder form, mix it with water, and spray it. It's a caterpillar killer. When the caterpillars eat it, along with the vegetable, it turns into a crystal in their gut, and they stop feeding. And so eventually they'll die. It's not harmful to other organisms, but I don't always trust these things, so I don't use it every day either. I use it when I see the pest out there. When I see the cabbage worms and I don't have enough students to come through and eat them, I will maybe use the BT, because it is a safe product. You can actually, technically, legally, you can use it on the day that you harvest the product. I would never do that. I use it maybe twice in a season, maybe sometimes once, and if I don't have the pest, I don't use it at all. Safer Soap is a brand of soap that kills soft-bodied insects. Aphid and whiteflies, especially in the greenhouse or inside in these environments that are really good for their growth. Ladybugs will eat aphids, syrphid flies will eat aphids, a lot of things will. Sometimes you'll have an infestation that you got ladybugs on there, but they're just not quite doing the job. You can actually spray the Safer Soap, and it won't kill the ladybugs, it'll kill the aphids. And whatever few that are left, because it's not 100%, the ladybugs will come and clean up. So that's the beautiful thing about this, is that it doesn't kill other pests. And I put on there a question, what about pyrethrins and neem? Might be something that you've heard of. Pyrethrins are natural. They're from the chrysanthemum flower, and they kill insects. But they actually kill all kinds of insects. So this is something you probably don't want to use in your garden. I hesitate to use it on the farm. I've never had to. I thought I was going to have to use it on Mexican bean beetles. They were getting so bad. But the year I bought it, I was going to use it. I knew they were going to be even worse. I had a hard time getting a crop the year before. They virtually disappeared. And I like to think it's my good cultural practices and things that I'm doing on the farm. I just can't be sure, because that year we had a late frost, April 9th. It was down into the 20s. And that might have taken care of them. I don't know. So these more powerful things are things that you want to avoid. Just because they're organic doesn't mean they are good for you or good for the garden, even though they may be a little bit better for the earth. All right, the next section, we'll go to the next slide, is a section on 4 seasons of growing. And I'm sorry I didn't change the name. Being from having spent 5 years in Atlanta and in Georgia, there's Atlanta and then there's the rest of Georgia. So, but anyway, this was from a presentation I gave to a group in Atlanta. But there's 4 seasons of growing. And even though we're a little bit further up into the mountains, you can make 4 seasons of growing happen here. And there are things that you can at least overwinter. If you can't harvest in January, you can at least have some things growing in the garden. Spring is a great time to plant, and a time that people often don't start early enough with the right things. These are the things that you can grow right now. You can plant them right now. It's starting to get late on some of them. A lot of these, like cabbage and broccoli, I like to have ready to transplant on the 1st of March. So we're getting a little late on those, but definitely the lettuce, greens like arugula, kale, mustard, those are fairly quick. Beets and carrots might be harder, but you can do radish and some of the short varieties of turnips. Now on turnips, my grandmother, she's not around anymore, but she loved turnips. She's about the only person I know that loved a turnip. And I've found this variety called Hakurai. It's a little white Japanese salad turnip, and it is sweet, and a lot of people like that turnip. But those big old purple things, Grandma loved them, and maybe y'all do too, I don't know. Other crops to grow, peas, you can actually grow sugar snapper, English peas if you start them early enough. You can start them back on Valentine's Day in most places because they're very cold tolerant. The worst problem you're going to have planting them too cold is that the seed is going to take so long to germinate they might rot in the field. So you want to watch the weather and all, make sure they don't get too wet. Potatoes are a good thing to grow in the early springtime as well. I used to try to plant potatoes as early as possible, back in February or 1st of March. What I found is that they are frost sensitive. They'll come back, but it really hurts them. And so I'll wait till mid-March to plant my potatoes, or even This year I'm going to plant them next week. Got them all ready, got the ground ready. But they like the cool weather. They won't form tubers if the soil is too warm. So those are all good things to grow in the spring. And I find it really handy to plan out my garden ahead of time so that when the time comes, I know what I'm going to plant. I've ordered the seeds and all that. And I'll talk towards the end a little more about rotations and planting. But now we'll go to the next slide, which is summer. This is when a lot of people get out in the garden, because now that the weather is warm and the sun is shining, geez, what are we all doing inside anyway? We should be out there digging. All right, I'm out of here, taking that shovel. But you can prepare the ground now for the summer. You may not be able to plant till the end of April or the 1st of May, some of these hot season things, but you need to get your ground prepared. You can turn over your ground right now, till it, or just with a shovel turn it over, give it a couple weeks, and go in there and stir it up again, because the biological activity will decompose any weeds or grass that are in there over just a few weeks if they've got ample moisture. But the things you can grow in the summer when you're doing your garden planting, of course, the nightshades, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, these are in the same plant family. Beans like snap beans, pole beans, edamame. Who's had edamame? All right. Y'all know what it is then. Green soybean. This is not, don't go out into your neighbor's 100-acre soybean field and grab some soybeans. But these are a special variety that are eaten green. You can cook them just for about 5 minutes. You pick them when the pod is nice and full, cook them for about 5 minutes, pull them out. You might cool them down, put a little salt on them. They're really good. They're kind of like boiled peanuts. And they're a different kind of bean you can grow in the summer. And then Shelly beans are kind of, you let like a pole bean go to the stage where it's like leather britches is another name for this, where you shell it and it's kind of fresh. It's still fresh. It's not dried. It cooks a lot more quickly than fully dried beans. But that's something you can do, especially if you hadn't had time to get out there and pick your beans. When they're real tender, you can shell them and cook them more like a dried bean. And there are lots of great varieties. If you're into heirloom seeds, beans are one thing that you can often find really interesting heirlooms people have passed down over generations. The Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. Southern Exposure is a seed catalog you can get. They've got a lot of heirlooms. And then there's the Seed Savers Exchange, which is a national. They have a catalog, and they also have a master list of seed savers who offer certain seeds on their own. So the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange and the Seed Savers Exchange are two sources. And they'll have a lot of interesting beans if you like dried beans or the shelly type beans. Cucurbits, summer squash, winter squash, cucumbers, those can all be grown in the summertime. People love to think that winter squash will grow over the winter, but it doesn't. It just saves over the winter. That's when you eat it. Make soups. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, which is fall. Cole crops. These are all in the same plant family: kale, collards, broccoli, cabbage. You can add to that mustard, arugula. There's a whole list. Tender greens, cress. These are all great to grow in the fall. And I start my seeds, the things I'm going to transplant, like broccoli and cabbage, when it is so hot I can't bear it anymore, I go inside and I plant my broccoli and cabbage around the 1st of August, so that I have a transplant to put in the ground around the 1st of September. And that's towards the end of August, middle of August, I'll start thinking about planting some of these things out in the field. You also want to plant for winter. Sometimes sweet potatoes have to be planted back in the early summer, but they're harvested in the fall, and the root crops do really well in the fall because they can kind of overwinter or go into the winter anyway. You plant them in late August, September, and what you don't pull will keep growing and sit in the ground, and you can eat those roots all winter. And you plant garlic and onions at this time. Around sometime in October is a great time to plant garlic. You can get organic garlic at the store. Break those cloves apart and plant it right side up, a couple inches down, and grow your garlic over the winter time. Fava beans or something. Who's had a fava bean? All right, this is a cultured audience. Fava beans are great to grow over the winter. You can plant them in the fall. The problem with that is that here in the south, we have these wide temperature swings. So we'll have a couple days where it's 70 degrees. The fava beans start growing. They look great. Everything's beautiful. And then it's 20 degrees one night. And they can survive it, but they'll break and fall over. And some winters are so brutal, they won't make it. So what I started doing is planting my fava beans as soon as I've got the ground scratched up in the spring. Maybe even the 1st of February, I'll put them in the ground. They'll come up and grow for the spring and give me a nice crop. But they do like the cool weather. And the other thing to think about is cover crop planting in the winter, especially if you're not doing these other overwintered stuff. The protection that you can provide in the winter can be provided with floating row covers. These are a special agricultural fabric. You can get it at some of the good seed suppliers. And put it over your crops. You can actually float it over the row, hence the name, or better yet, provide some support for it, either wire hoops that are real low. We're talking about real low, just right over the crops, but the hoops will help hold this fabric off. Water goes through the fabric, light goes through the fabric, but the frost doesn't go through the fabric. So this can be the difference between a lettuce that just kind of sits there and doesn't look very tasty and one that is growing more lush over the winter. But they're not going to protect things like tomatoes that can't stand to freeze. It won't take care of the heat, the cold so much as the frost itself, the damaging frost. Root harvest over the winter. Pea tips and pea flowers. Pea tips are a great thing to eat if you've got Austrian winter peas as a cover crop. Their little growing tips are quite tender and edible. So you just take that little growing tip and put it in a salad or chop it up and stir fry it. And can also be grown over the winter in a windowsill. If you take a tray of soil, a couple handfuls of the Austrian winter peas that you got left over from your cover cropping, and about 3 weeks of good water and a little bit of sunshine protection, there'll be little shoots, and you just cut those off. They're a great thing to eat over the winter. I'm thinking about this because that's what I've been eating the last couple weeks before I've got any crops coming out, to eat some fresh food. Now, this is something that you may or may not be able to use effectively in your garden, but if you have a bigger garden, I'd encourage you to think about it. Think about where your plants are each year, plan out some kind of rotation. Even if you just have 4 little raised beds or something, you know, do your tomatoes there this year, and next year plant your cabbage there or something else, beans, and rotate your crops. It'll also help you plan out when you're going to plant some cover crops. You can write down when you're going to add compost and things like that. Planning goes a long way in good gardening. But these are the things that crop rotations can do for you in your garden. They can help you control your pests. They can help control your weeds. They can help with your crop fertility, because the same crops will take the same amount of the nutrients out of the soil. So if you grow them year after year, you're going to be deficient in exactly what that crop needs from the soil. So if you rotate, you at least have that, even in a garden setting. Disease control. There are certain diseases, especially like tomato wilt. If you have tomatoes that wilt when they have plenty of water, that's a disease. And if you grow tomatoes there next year, I bet you're going to have the same disease again. But if you move them to the furthest bed away, you may be able to grow tomatoes without having that problem. So the next slide starts on how to design a rotation. And the first thing you do is you inventory the crops. You think about what you're going to grow. Are you going to grow beans? Are you going to grow squash, cucumbers? Then you want to detail what the needs of those crops are. When do they grow? When do they have to be planted? When do they get harvested? What kind of fertility needs do they have? How are they going to be mulched? These are all the things you need to think about and write down when you're designing a rotation. Garden design and arranging the crops. So you want to design your garden with spaces in which you can rotate. You know, if you have a few beds, just number your beds, make a little map. That's the first step in designing a rotation. We'll go to the next slide, and it shows how I did it at Gaia Gardens. And this is an overhead view of an 1.5 acre garden with 12 spaces that are each 5,000 square feet. But hey, this could be an overhead view of your home garden that's 100 square feet with a few different plots. But basically, each of these numbered plots is the same size. That allows me to rotate them really easily. Even though 1 through 4 are 200 feet long, 25 feet wide, they're the same area as 5 and 6. So what's in 5 this year will be in 4 next year, and it'll just rotate one to the other very easily. So I've got these standard blocks. But the main thing is having a map of your garden. That's the first step in any crop rotation planning or garden planning. And measuring it. If you know how much you've got, you know how many plants you need to buy. You don't buy too many or too few. You know how many seeds to buy. Seed catalogs are very tempting to buy too many seeds. But if you know how much space you've got, that'll give you some idea. You might buy a packet of beans that'll last you 3 years because you just have space for 6 feet of a row. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. This is maybe a lot to look at or think about. I use Excel. I have a big place. You can just make a little chart if you'd rather, but this is the key information to have for designing your rotations, which is what crop you're going to grow, what variety you've ordered from the seed company, what field or bed it's going to be in. The number of beds for me is an indication of size. All my beds are the same size, but you might have something like row feet. I've got the row feet on there as well on the edge, but that may take the place of number of beds and days to harvest. So I know if I'm going to grow Pac-Man broccoli, that field has got to be ready about 2 weeks before I'm going to grow the broccoli because I got to get it tilled in and ground prepared. So that's 64 days, add to that, and then I can plant something else. So that's my window for broccoli is when I got to, from the time when I'm going to start preparing the ground to when that crop is going to be harvested. The days to harvest can be found on seed packets. If you've ever seen that days to harvest, they will not ever match up to the number of days it takes you to grow that crop. And the reason is that there are all different kinds of conditions. And one thing interesting I've learned about gardening through the seasons is that when in the springtime, things will accelerate in growth. So if you plant lettuce today and you plant lettuce next week, those are going to be ready on the same day, okay? It really speeds up. And then in the fall, it's the opposite. You can plant lettuce today and in a week, and it'll stretch out because it starts getting colder and colder. So when you're looking at your rotations, think about that. And that brings up another point, which is sequence cropping. If you like lettuce, don't go out and plant 100 heads of lettuce tomorrow. Plant 5 or 10. And then in 2 weeks, plant another 10 or however many you'll eat in 2 or 3 weeks. And that way you'll have it continuously. So you want to try and plant crops as early as you can and maybe as late as you can too. You can always count backwards from the frost date, like for tomatoes, or something. Maybe we've got something up there, beans. Okay, 55 days to harvest. So you might add 14 days to that just to be sure in the fall, and subtract that from your first frost date in the fall, and that's how you know the latest time you can plant beans. So I recommend on a lot of these things to plant them more than once. But you got to have the space for it. Okay, next slide talks about plant families. And I've brought up this concept, but plants can be grouped into families. They're closely related. Squash, melons, cucumbers are all in the same family. Does anyone know what a loofah is? Have you grown that before? That's a natural sponge, yeah. You can grow it. It grows like a cucumber, except you trellis it and you let it hang all season. At the end of the season, the skin is coming off, seeds come out of it. You can cut it up and use it as a dish sponge or in the shower. I'm not kidding. I used to use one all the time, then I got married. Something about that, I don't know. Maybe I'll use it again. But they'll last longer than a synthetic sponge. So if you like natural products, that's one way you can grow your sponges. But this is just the concept of plant families and thinking about your plants and families, because just as you don't want to grow tomato after tomato, you don't want to necessarily grow tomato after pepper after eggplant after potato either, because they're all in the same plant family. And to see the relationship between plant families, you're more likely to look at the flower to see the relationship. So the Convolvulaceae, the sweet potato family, is also the morning glory family. Sweet potatoes have flowers very similar to morning glories, even though they look, have different products. Malvaceae, okra, and cotton are both in that family. Just looking up and understanding which ones are in the same families. See, spinach and beets you might not think of. The Asteraceae is a huge family, but mostly flowers, but also lettuce and endive are in that family. So the next slide has a few more plant families. You can see there are a lot of common families, and you can really use this in your rotations to vary what you're growing. The Liliaceae is a grass-related family, and garlic and onions are in that family. They are closely related to grasses. The Apiaceae, does anybody know why the Apiaceae is called that? Apis mellifera is the honeybee, and they love the Apiaceae plant family. Carrot, celery, fennel, cilantro. If any of those bloom in your garden, you want to leave those blooms because they will attract beneficial insects. They've got nectaries that those beneficials can actually get to and feed on. So they're a really good beneficial crop to grow. And the Brassicaceae is a huge family of mostly spring and fall planted things. Fabaceae, the beans and peas, and this includes the mimosa tree is a bean family. There are other trees that are in the bean family. These fix nitrogen, and they're light feeders. Okay, so the next slide starts to tell you about heavy feeders and light feeders. These are some of the heavy feeders. You might be surprised things like basil are on there. Cold crops are on there. Cucumbers and squash, they're in the same family, so that makes sense. Spinach and beets are also in the same family. But this is from a book called Golden Gate Gardening, but these kind of lists can be found in various publications. And these are heavier feeders on the soil. And in general, you want to follow a heavy feeder with a light feeder. And you might want to pre-seed a heavy feeder by application of compost, or pre-seed it with a legume or bean, or a good cover crop. So you don't want to plant heavy feeder after heavy feeder. So you got the plant families to look at, you got the amount that they feed. Don't get bogged down on all these details. You'd have to create a matrix to figure out exactly what to do. It's just things to think about when you're planning out your garden. So the next slide, we'll go to our light feeders. Carrots, leeks, peppers, and potatoes. So tomatoes were on the heavy feeder list, and peppers are on the light feeder list. But just think about varying what goes in your garden over time. Go to the next slide. This is about garden design. And the one thing that'll help you make a rotation is standardizing your garden. Rows of the same length are easier. For example, if you use drip irrigation, you have a header that supplies the water to tubing that has holes punched in it. Basically how it works. And so that drip tape is going to be the same length for whatever rows. So if all your rows are the same length, that'll be the same length. I like straight rows. They're easier to cultivate, but of course you get more plants in a curvy row. That's well known. And if you have contours, you want to plow along the contour. You definitely want to measure and mark your garden so you know how much space you're dealing with, and make a map. And that can be simple or more complicated, as complicated as you want to make it. Now, the next slide tells you about arranging crops. The note card method for arranging crops is once you've got your crop inventory, if we go back to that idea, what we're going to do, crop inventory, crop needs. So you got your inventory, you take out a bunch of note cards and you write down different crops that you want to grow, one on each note card, and you start arranging them into, okay, I'm going to do this one the first year, and the second year I'm going to go with a light feeder because that one was a heavy feeder, and then got to change the plant family, so next year will be something different. You start to develop your rotation by shuffling around the note cards. And the first time you do it, you'll have some issues in there, and you'll go back to your notes about plant families and heavy feeders and shuffle them around a little bit. Once you got it like you want it, you write that as a list, and then you know what to plant when and where. The next slide is actually my rotation plan, and it's a little hard to see, and you don't need to know the details of this. But what I do want to point out is that the green spaces are cover crops. So there's oats and clover, there are cowpeas and Sudan grass in the summertime, rye and vetch, but I've fit those in between my crops. And the yellow are the cash crops, and you can see that cash crops are almost always followed by a cover crop, which is almost always followed by a cash crop. And there are some blocks larger than others where we have longer cycles of cover cropping. The mulch and the mineral additions are labeled on the outside. Those are actually in the wrong place, but the idea is that you can decide when to put your mulch down. So if you have a heavy feeder, put it down before that and get it written down so you can keep it straight in the heat of the season. So that's how to do rotations, basically. The next slide will tell you a little bit about transplant production. Now, you may not be able to raise transplants at home, but there are some good reasons to do so. If you go down to your garden center for your planting varieties, they're not going to have all the varieties under the sun. They're going to have a few good varieties that will produce well. But as you start looking at the seed catalogs, you'll see that there's a whole world of colors, flavors, and different varieties that you might want to grow. And growing your own transplants are a good way to do that. You can also get early production. You can have better scheduling. Reducing insect disease and weed pressure. None of the nurseries are perfect. They can come in with diseases, and you can bring those in with plants that you buy. It's possible. Transplant production as opposed to direct seeding also gives you more time to prepare the soil. Then go to the next slide. What is a healthy transplant? If you're growing transplants at home, of course they need water, everybody knows that, and they need warmth to germinate. But as soon as you see anything emerge from the soil, they need lots of high quality light. By high quality light, I mean direct sunlight or incandescent lights, the old style, not the new fluorescents. But as soon as that seedling emerges, it needs lots of light. And glass will actually polarize light, so if you've ever noticed your little seedlings on the windowsill going right to that window, that's because the glass is actually polarizing the light. If you're able to provide a situation like a greenhouse or maybe a back room you can heat and have plastic covering the window instead of glass, it diffuses light. And the plants will not go towards a plastic sheet, but they will go towards glass. So what you're looking for on a healthy transplant is a short, stocky stem. You want a short transplant. You want to look for the cotyledons. The cotyledons are seed leaves. All plants, when they germinate, have the seed leaves. They look different from the true leaves. On beans, it's real obvious because most of the bean are the seed leaves, and that comes out, and then the true leaves begin. But on a transplant, even a little plant ready to go in the garden, you want to have the cotyledons intact with good color on them. That's a healthy transplant. So if you go to the garden center and you don't see cotyledons on your little transplants, they've undergone some kind of stress. Or at home, that's a way to troubleshoot. If you're making your soil, you want a nutrient reserve in it for fast growth and continued growth. And so I add compost to my potting mix. That's how I continue to feed the plants as they go. You could also use some of those soluble nutrients like the fish emulsion, kelp, and such like that. And you also want your transplants to be free of insects and disease. So you don't want to see any problems with the transplants when you get them home, or if you're already growing them yourself, you want to make sure you're not starting with any problems with disease. So those are the things to look for. You want a short and stocky stem and those healthy cotyledons. And you want a smaller plant in a bigger pot when you're at the garden center. You don't want a big old flowering plant in a tiny little pot because it's going to be more likely to be root bound. You want to plant a smaller plant in a bigger pot. Okay, the next slide is actually my recipe, and I hope you can make it out on the handout so you won't have to write it all down, but perlite, vermiculite. Vermiculite is actually it's actually quite dangerous to handle. It's a dust, and it's a really bad dust like asbestos. When it's wet, it's safe. So if you're using it, you have to wear a respirator if it's dry, or wet it down as soon as you can to keep that dust down. So you can just leave that out of your mix at home. If you're going to make your potting mix, just leave the vermiculite out. You don't want to deal with it. Perlite, sifted compost, good sifted compost, lime, and what's missing here is peat moss, and that's a big thing to be missing, okay? You see, most of the big ingredients are 4 cubic feet. These are the big bags. You can break it down for your smaller garden into smaller sizes and just use equivalencies, but the peat moss is missing. It needs to be in up there. I use 6 cubic feet of peat moss now to 4 cubic feet of perlite. And the lime is very important when you're using peat moss. Peat moss is acidic, so if you make your own potting mix, you need to mix in some lime with it. The Fertrol 424 is a bagged organic amendment that I mix in for some nutrients, and azomite and kelp meal are for micronutrients. Kelp live out in the sea where all the minerals found on land are found in equal parts in the sea, and it's a source for micronutrients for that plant. That'll help with your plant health, plant stress, transplant stress quite a bit. Azomite is a mined mineral that's a powdered dust, and it also has a lot of micronutrients. So you can get organic potting mix now at local places, so that's a good way to start. If it were me growing a home garden and I didn't have what I have at the farm, I would probably buy a good organic mix and that's OMRI listed and add compost to it, because that'll make it healthier. And my final slide is some resources of organizations. And these are resources, but also maybe something that you want to get involved with. I've had a great time being involved on the Georgia Organics Board while I was in Georgia. Great organization to serve and be a member of. They just had their annual conference this weekend, and we had a great time, learned a lot, networked with other gardeners and growers, and there are people there who just like to eat. And there are people there who have 1,000 acres with organic beef cows and their own processing plant. So it's a whole range of people, but all people interested in natural food and healthy eating. Localharvest.org is a good way to find a local farmer or nursery. That's a good place to go, see who's in your area. You can put in your zip code and find local folks. Community Food Security Coalition is one that works with social justice in food, and that is not, it's not a food lockup for the community, but it's actual security for your community. If your community is getting all their food from outside, that is a food insecure community. If something happened, gas prices go up or some calamity and you can't get food. A lot of communities, for example, Atlanta, I've heard there's 3 days of food in Atlanta. So they're very dependent on outside. But growing your own food is a good way to do that, or becoming a member of that organization. Southern Sustainable Ag Working Group is a regional organization, and next year their conference is going to be in Chattanooga. So I'd highly recommend for you to go to that. Has anybody been to Southern SOG here? I know there's somebody over there, and Scott has as well. But Southern SOG is a great place to go for information from growers and about gardening and growing. It's regional, so you got the best and the brightest from the whole region. And I would highly recommend that y'all go. It's always in January, at the end of January, ssawg.org. And then Carolina Farm Stewards, that's in South Carolina. But these are just examples of organizations that would be good to be a part of. You can learn and share with others who are interested in organic gardening. So I want to thank you all for having me today. Thank you for your time.